This evening is dedicated to the climate change negotiations that have been taking place practically on a permanent basis for the past years. And I would like to contribute the political science perspective on this process, and particularly to bring inside information that is not very readily available outside of these processes. The climate talks are a distinctly intense process, and one could argue that it is the most important process of international negotiations at this stage of history, by virtue of the implications, the pervasive implications of these talks for modern societies and their future shape. At the same time, very few people have access to proper information. The few scholars, at least in political science, who try to attend the talks usually obtain a yellow badge through civil society. It doesn't really give access behind closed doors where the real negotiations take place. And just following the media coverage during these events, I do not cease to be amazed at the differences between the public perception of these talks and the impressions of journalists on the one hand, and on the other hand, the palpable realities, political realities during the negotiations and what is actually taking place. Just to give one brief example before we dive into the presentation, in Copenhagen, the world was expecting a new global agreement, while this idea was dropped by all countries 1 month before Copenhagen during a round of negotiations in Barcelona, where an implicit agreement was made to in a way greenwash the conference by creating some form of agreement that can be presented to the world as the next climate deal, while the understanding was always that that was not going to be binding. These talks take place in various locations, and most of the work actually gets done in smaller meetings that take place on average every 3 months. There is a 1 or 2 week conference somewhere. So what I would like to do today is focus on 3 particular topics. I'd like to give you an update on how the negotiations are going, what are the major points of progress, what are the obstacles, and the recent political dynamics. Secondly, I'd like to draw a contrast between that first aspect of the process and the state of global climate governance that comprises multi-level policies at various levels. And finally, I'd like to advance several theoretical arguments that pertain to the role of persuasion and argumentation, not only in the negotiations, but also how these affect climate policies around the world. I must also be fair at the beginning and say that my views are not widely shared by colleagues in political science. And we have had some very, very interesting academic debates. The story really should start in Durban, South Africa in 2011, which I consider to be the most important conference in recent history. And this is the room in which the current approach to negotiations was finalized among ministers. The room was very small. The formula was minister plus 4. That means maximum 4 people from each delegation could join the minister, which really left a lot of negotiators out of the room. During this session, all countries had to give their opinion on this document. And this document really was a proposal on the big picture in the global response to climate change. Where exactly was the process heading and how it should be organized after repeated failures? Forgive please the coffee stains, because at that stage of a very conference, caffeine is the only thing that keeps you going. And everybody prays for good coffee, because life is too short to drink bad coffee. The document was only 2 pages, and essentially what it said when you translate it into plain English was cancel negotiations altogether, renew the process a year later, and then go for an agreement that will apply only after 2020. This was the absolutely worst document in history as far as any country was concerned who wanted to see serious climate action. Everybody took turns taking their position, and the majority said this is very, very far from adequate. There were countries who said this will put on death row entire nations. Even Saudi Arabia opposed it, which was quite remarkable. Even China opposed it. There were only 3 countries who implicitly endorsed this sort of arrangement, and those were the United States, Australia, and Canada. So the document was not really accepted in its current form, but we came pretty close to what in what was actually agreed. I should say very briefly that in Durban, the Kyoto Protocol was extended with a much weaker agreement that now covers only 15% of global emissions and relies on the bottom-up approach of voluntary domestic actions. They also finally established the Green Climate Fund, which was a clear step forward and a positive development. And finally, they adopted the formal legal mandate, which today governs the negotiations. And the mandate doesn't matter because they cannot step outside of it. According to this mandate, we're working on a new agreement that crucially is going to cover all major emitters, which is a real milestone in the history of the talks. But it is going to apply indeed only after 2020, and we have December of this year as the formal deadline to finalize it. What is less commonly known is that if you look carefully at the legal mandate and the text, there is no guarantee that this process actually leads to a binding agreement. Because India made sure that they dilute the mandate to open the gate for a non-binding arrangement. Here is the actual text. This is a process to develop a protocol, another legal instrument, or, is the key word here, an agreed outcome with legal force. And international lawyers tell us that this is extremely vague, and this could potentially lead to a one-page political declaration that can be declared an agreed outcome. So, what has been happening? The issues under negotiations comprise a very, very long list. And even a very superficial look at this will tell you that governments today are negotiating everything under the sun. There is no aspect of a modern society that is not under negotiations here. From energy production and consumption to industrial manufacturing, transportation, agriculture, food production. We have a number of technical issues. We have intellectual property rights, the technology transfer, finance remains an ubiquitous issue, loss and damage, and possible compensation to developing countries for the negative effects of climate change. What has transpired so far is that the process now has turned completely away from the standard model of international law to work towards a binding treaty that then countries are expected to implement, and has embraced the bottom-up approach. And the bottom-up approach, once again, is every country decides unilaterally what it is ready to accomplish domestically without any international pressure. Then, presumably, they announce it publicly at the international level, and they go ahead, and whatever the aggregate impact of those domestic commitments are, that is then the climate regime that we end up with. If you look at the new negotiating text that was just adopted, however, there are not even strict reporting requirements for countries to actually say internationally what they're going to do. And I think that in general we're heading towards a very, very weak agreement. This is this is where the next round of negotiation will start this coming Monday for 2 weeks. The World Conference Center in Bonn, Germany. Most of the negotiations this year will take place in Bonn. We have 3 more rounds before Paris. And I would like to now focus your attention on some of the most recent developments. The first one is that, unlike previous negotiations, countries are not talking a great deal about details. Australia described this as the helicopter approach to negotiations, to focus on the big picture, on the overall international collective action and the general division of labor. There has been practically no negotiations on a draft treaty text, which is absolutely remarkable because we are only 6 or so months before Paris. Finally, next week, we're starting working on formal negotiations on text, which means that before Durban in 2011, and now, which is almost 4 years, there has been no palpable output of these negotiations. Politically speaking, however, there are some very interesting developments that are not being widely discussed in the academic literature, which I think have actually very important ramifications. And this is my take on this. The rise of a new coalition is quite notable. I'm sorry, this is technology. I think some government is trying to censor this presentation. And nonetheless, there is a rise of a new coalition called the Like-Minded Developing Countries. This is a group of about 30 developing countries. A very strange mix between Saudi Arabia, Bolivia, Venezuela, China. India is also part of it, a very important member. And what they really argue is sticking to the principles of the Framework Convention on Climate Change that differentiates between developing and developed countries. And they're really fighting as hard as possible to weaken an agreement, especially when it comes to the developing countries. This is not new. What is new is that there are only 30 members of this coalition out of 130 developing countries. And that means that there is an even deeper rift among developing countries on important issues. And most notably, while India and China are part of this blocking coalition, Brazil is not, and Saudi and South Africa are not either, the other 2 major emitters in the developing world. When I've spoken to members of the Brazilian delegation, they have openly told me that they think that China and India are taking quote-unquote extreme positions, which is not something that you would ever have heard from a basic country before. And therefore, I think that there is a new tension, if not outright conflict, among basic countries. Those are the major emitters in the developing world. And I think that the West might have an opportunity to be Machiavellian about it. If this rift is exploited skillfully, there may be new progress there. mandate says agreement covering all main emitters, I think that the major step forward in this process is that there is a growing consensus that differentiation is over between the developing and the developed world. I also want to point out that if you look at the negotiation text, there are repeated references to quote-unquote decarbonization by 2050. That in itself is quite ambitious. That implies complete decarbonization. With some of the text proposals, even referring to negative growth of emissions after 2050. That is something new that we haven't seen in other texts before. And therefore, from a certain point of view, there is now political readiness to move in a very serious way. Yes, indeed. This is really frozen. Clearly, one of the important developments is the agreement, the bilateral deal between the United States and China that was announced last November. This was not a surprise to anyone in the negotiations because there were rumors that the two countries are talking secretly. Many people expect that this will be a real turning point because China and the United States together, being the two major emitters, account for 42% of global emissions. If they have a bilateral deal, that is quite important, even for its symbolic value. However, when it comes to the surface of it, I think it is fair to conclude that the global negotiations are going very slowly and remain at the agenda setting stage of regime formation, where they're still talking about the very basic principles of a future agreement. And I think that the prospects for Paris are quite bleak. And this is not simply a personal opinion. I have spoken to many diplomats. Diplomats are usually very, very wary and cautious in making predictions. The typical comment you will hear from a diplomat is, oh, it's too early to tell, we hope for the better, this and this. Now I have lunch with the head of the Japanese delegation, one-on-one, and he tells me that nothing's going to take place in Paris, right? That there's no way that there will be meaningful agreement. I've been told this from other diplomats from Brazil, from the European Union, and that is quite uncommon, and I think a very telling sign. Personally, I think there will be a deal in Paris. I think they will find a grandiose title for it, and I think it will be hollow, without truly binding commitments. I think it will be intended primarily for public consumption, particularly because it's very important for the French to declare the conference a big success. It will be crucial to read between the lines and the legal details inside it. It is also indicative that Christiana Figueres, who is essentially the UN climate boss, who is presiding in a certain sense of the negotiations, is making public statements that the Paris Agreement will be, quote unquote, facilitative, and that it's not going to be a silver bullet. I don't think that these are good signs. The implications of the US-China deal are expected to be very large. What is very interesting is that when we went to Peru and Lima, later on in Geneva, there's no actual change in the conversation in the dynamics. So even if there are implications of this new bilateral deal, they haven't become tangible yet. Here comes the interesting part. I'm actually ready to argue that climate diplomacy has already succeeded. Yes, from a conventional point of view, it is a complete failure and a repeated failure to produce strong formal treaties. But I think that there are indirect impacts that really have fundamental ramifications for climate governance. This is where I should be putting my my academic hat as a political scientist. I think diplomacy has succeeded by altering cost-benefit calculations among policymakers, both in the private sector and governments around the world, not in a particular region. I think that diplomacy and negotiations can and do, in this case, facilitate policy change without producing formal agreements. That is, I think, very different from the conventional wisdom in the study of international relations, where typically the community has followed negotiations and diplomacy as the crucial mechanisms for producing international policy instruments under international agreements. And when that fails, then we declare it a failure. But in this case, we're seeing something very, very different. I think that the role of the conversation is central, and there have been arguments tabled during the negotiations that have led to the reformulation of national interests. So this is where the presentation is really heading. Persuasion is really the key word here. Despite the general feeling that this is an important factor in any context during negotiations, the academic study of international relations does not really have a lot of publications that focus on this. It is the terra incognita. Are we hearing? Excuse me. It is the terra incognita of diplomacy. And several years ago, I received a large grant that allowed me to travel with a small group of research assistants to UN conferences, to run audio and video records. And the focus of the project was, when governments negotiate, what do they actually say to one another? What are the microdynamics of communication? What is the actual exchange? We were able to produce quite extensive audio records and a partial video record consisting of hundreds and hundreds of hours. And the result was a list, a typology of argumentative approaches to negotiations, 6 of them to be more precise. And central was the somewhat intuitive discovery that governments invest actually a lot of political effort in purposeful communication in an attempt to change the minds and policy preferences of their counterparts. And some approaches are clearly more effective than others. Quite frankly, many countries, they do not really negotiate. They appear, they tell everyone what they want, and then they repeat it hundreds of times over several years. That is not real negotiation. So the question is, what works and what doesn't, and that leads us to identify the winning argument. To be very blunt about it, I think that the winning argument came from the European Union. Early this century, the EU introduced the idea that climate policy can bring economic benefits. That was very, very novel at the time and very strange, because the talks in the 1990s were marked by an absolute consensus that climate policy is extremely expensive. the underlying question had always been, how much can we afford to do to the economy? Right? And the Europeans really turned the tables on this. And they started speaking about win-win solutions. This is a quote that they made at the round, explaining what they're ready to commit to, and they say the most striking thing in the IPCC report is that there are global win-win solutions. A significant part of mitigation is available at low or no cost and brings additional benefits for energy security and air pollution in what is referred to as win-win solutions. I think that the most interesting thing on this slide is actually the date. 2007. It was around that time that I am ready to argue that there was a turning point in global climate governance. The European, I will explain in a few minutes what I mean. The Europeans based their entire negotiating strategy on the win-win concept. It was literally impossible for many years to hear any formal statement on behalf of the European Union that did not integrate the economic argument. Here is just one anecdotal example of Run's statement in Copenhagen. To the developed world, I say, environmental action is the most powerful engine of job creation in an economy urgently in need of millions of new jobs. To the developing world, I say that technology now exists to gain the dividends of a high-growth economy without incurring the damage of a high-carbon economy. Nothing about polar bears, nothing about environment, nothing about climate change really. This was an entirely economic argument, and it was tabled aggressively over and over. And this is the time to say that the Stern report, which really was a landmark for many academic communities, actually was part of that negotiating strategy with the UK government essentially sponsoring it. The EU, this is another example that comes from the 2008 Energy and Climate Package. This is the document from the European Commission. Again, it speaks about opening the door to new opportunities. There is a real potential to make climate-friendly policies a major driver for growth and jobs in Europe. And the EU took also the unilateral leadership through actions, not just words. Quite notably, they followed up with real policies that were consistent with what they were saying internationally. This has been, I know that this may be controversial, but from an outside perspective and an academic perspective, it is fairly consistent because we have the 2008 policy package, that is binding on all members. Then the European Commission followed with a longer-term perspective called Roadmap 2050. And they run numbers, and they were arguing that even though there's uncertainty about the benefits, we could actually see the benefits exceeding the investment in low carbon economy. The fact that the European Council approved very recently the new policy for 2030, and that it is more ambitious than before, also confirms that this is more or less a consistent policy process. And the economic rationale has been integral to it. There have been other publications. It was not simply the European Union speaking internationally. You will hear the same themes from the World Business Council on Sustainable Development, the OECD, the International Energy Agency, and also more recently from the Global Commission on the Economy and Climate. What is notable, however, is again to look at the dates, that these publications from international organizations did not start coming after the EU had very consistently made this their key negotiating strategy. The Global Commission on the Economy and Climate recently produced another report that is simply reinforcing this idea. And what they're saying is that overall investment in the high carbon economy is expected to be 90 trillion over the next 15 years, which is approximately 6 trillion per year. And what they argue is that, by contrast, investment in low carbon development would require only an additional 270 billion. But that much of it, and probably all of it, can actually be offset by the benefits from energy efficiency, for instance, in renewables. So by now we see a growing chorus, if not a consensus, coming from various international organizations at the governmental level and also the non-state actors. And not coincidentally, we also observe a global pattern of policy developments, both in government and non-state sectors, that point to a low carbon development. In addition to EU policies, China has emerged as a leader in renewable energy investment. They invest 3 times as much as the United States. Their previous 5-year plan that dictates their development was described to me by diplomats as, quote-unquote, the most progressive piece of legislation towards a low-carbon development. South Korea officially adopted what they call green growth as the paradigm for their future economic development. Australia in 2007 established a new department on climate change, and very, very curiously, they chose Martin Parkinson to be heading that department. And what's notable is that Parkinson, for the previous 6 years, had been the chief of their macroeconomic development, and then they put him to head the climate change department. Today, or rather I should say in 2012, 67% of global emissions were under legislation and action, or both. Or action, or both. And this was a very dramatic increase compared to 5 years before that, because in 2007 there were only 45% of global emissions covered. What is notable is that the global population that was in communities where such climate legislation exists increased from 36% to 76%. And in Asia, now it is 97% of people who live in such communities. I think that this allows us to conclude that there is a global pattern emerging, and it is instructive to look at the map. This again shows you those communities in 2007, and look what happens 5 years later. A very, very clear change. And I think that what is behind this, let's call it green shift, is the growing perception that indeed climate policy can be beneficial for the economy. Which is compatible with the European argument. And economists in China who are close to their government have openly written that China has recognized that fighting climate change represents a great opportunity, and this is a standard phrase used in China now, and they made a call in its official document for the country to seize the opportunity of green growth. So, in conclusion, on the one hand, the UN negotiations among governments on climate change are not going well. They're clearly shaping another failure at a meaningful, binding, traditional agreement. And the prospects for the conference that will take place this year in Paris are really quite weak. I do think, however, that this apparent diplomatic failure is misleading because it obscures the bigger and the brighter picture, and that is growing and consistent progress in policies related to both renewable energy, energy in general, and climate change around the world that can be observed both at the government level and the non-state level. And this has led some scholars to say, forget about the UN process, it is useless, it is futile, the real action is taking place on the ground, particularly through non-state initiatives. There have been books and articles written about it. I would disagree with this interpretation. I do think that UN diplomacy has been absolutely integral to that policy change that we see around the world, because it has, through the arguments tabled in the conversation, it has changed the perceptions of national interest and the cost-benefit calculations. Therefore, the argumentation, the conversation, has been a major driver of this policy change. And therefore, from an intellectual point of view, we do have to reconsider our academic approach to the study of diplomacy and look at the cognitive value of negotiations in the formation and reformulation of perceived interests. And I thank you for your attention. I do look forward to questions and comments.
Well, we normally take questions for, what time is it now? We normally take questions to about 6:30, and then break for less formal discussions upstairs in the Energy Institute.
I see.
So if you're happy to do that, then let's see what comes up.
Certainly, yes.
So, questions?
Maybe
Yes.
we can turn up the lights to see.
Yes, if we can have the lights up so we can see you. I'll take the question
All right.
first.
Yes,
Hi.
right.
Yeah, thanks for that. I was just thinking, if the cognitive kind of change that you talked about is occurring, why do you think there isn't more progress being made then at the formal level? What is explaining that lack of agreement? Because that would suggest that this would be moving forward towards an agreement.
This is a very shrewd insight, and to sort of bring out the connotation that I think you have in mind is, if everybody is moving in that direction, why can't they enshrine what they're doing in an international agreement, and why can't we see more progress at the UN? And I think that the answer is that people still feel that this is a very new policy arena, and governments are very wary of making international commitments under binding treaties. This is partly because they had very bitter experience with Kyoto. A number of countries made commitments under the Kyoto Protocol that they did not fully understand, and they did not really know what they're getting into and how much is actually feasible to do. Right? And because of this, they got burned, and now they're much more cautious. And I think that there are a great number of governments who are already, we've already set in motion policy apparatus at home, and yet continue to resist an international agreement because they do not want, they want the benefits of that action, but they do not want the international obligations that they see as somehow constraining, somehow burdensome. And I think that is why generally everybody has moved to this bottom-up approach.
Yeah, I think you were first. Yeah. By the way, could people give their names and their affiliations when they speak? So, please.
高島津が京都ユニバーシティやユーロピンオフィス。I like the you want is not binding, but it's still very, very influential to the many countries.
We don't have an agreement yet.
Yeah. But the very this kind of discussion or the international negotiation is very influential to each country.
Yes, that's correct.
The question is you also showed the US and China's big negotiations. And how can we assess the movement or activities or influence in China not fully understanding what's happening
Yes.
in Chinese people?
Yes. Essentially, the reason why Chinese policy has changed, and also policy in other countries, is because of ideas, new ideas that were circulated during the negotiations, and those ideas have changed the cost-benefit calculations when it comes to climate policy, and that has moved actors in the direction towards low carbon development. While at the same time, that same conversation has not really led to strong international agreements, binding or actually non-binding, because we do not even have yet a non-binding agreement. Right? So it is important, what I'm arguing is that the reason why UN diplomacy matters is simply because the ideas that were introduced and circulated in the process that have altered the perceptions of decision makers and their cost-benefit calculations. Does this make sense?
Yeah, cost, so the cost-benefit calculation depends on the country by countries.
Yes.
Then can you assess that each country is effective and each country is not so effective? Like that?
That, I think, is a topic that is related but separate from my topic tonight. Because I think that while there is a global pattern that we can observe, that there is a move in basically every continent in the same direction, there are clearly differences among countries in how far they're going, how successfully they're moving in that direction, how quickly they're moving in that direction. And that is a separate subject of study, and there are some scholars who have actually focused on analyzing why there are differences in national climate policies, right? But as somebody who studies international relations, my interest is slightly different, and that is that overall pattern, right, rather than the cross-national differences within it.
I wonder if we could pursue this perhaps afterwards. I'd like to take several questions. So, is that a question? Go for it.
No, it's good. My name is Jim Penman. Now, but I was the EU's Atlantic negotiator in I want to believe this. I mean, it seems to have a lot of sense to me. But how do you read the Australian desire to dig up coal in Queensland as fast as possible? Or
Sorry, can you repeat that?
how do you read the Australian desire to dig up coal in Queensland as fast as possible? Or the oil majors' huge investments in fossil fuel resources, highlighted in the Guardian today? I mean, I wondered.
Actually, I would take this specific case and pile up many more other cases where countries continue dirty development and they continue investments. 600 billion invested still in the fossil sector compared to 100 billion in the renewable sector. So it's still 1 to 6, right? So clearly, we're still deeply into fossil fuel development, and you can see many examples. Australia is just one of them, right? But I think that what we need to look at is the change over time when it comes to those ratios, investment, for example, in renewables versus fossil fuel. And there's a dramatic steep curve, right, when it comes to investment. So it is really the change over time that is the academic interest here, rather than how far have we gone. right? In fact, I would argue that we will see serious dirty development for the next decades, right? And therefore, anecdotally speaking, taking specific examples like that is going to mislead us in drawing conclusions. Again, the fact that over 5 years we have such a dramatic increase in those two maps that I showed is quite notable. And I also, at some point, would like to bring the notion of taking the proper historic perspective on this. Like, given the transition that we expect, how much time would something like this take, right? What is fair to expect? And what we can talk about this.
That has prompted a barrage of questions.
Nigel Isaacs from Victoria University of Wellington, New Zealand, a tiny little country. I think what you're saying is that the sum of the parts is greater than the individual parts. That the individual countries are saying, well, perhaps, but overall it's the big picture. I admire your faith, partly because I see many governments being elected, even with that legislation in place. And Australia is a very good example. It's a nice big splodge of blue on your map.
Yes.
But under the current government, that splodge is completely irrelevant.
Yep.
I think I wanted to add one other thing. I'm probably unique in the room. I attended in 1981 the UN Conference on New and Renewable Sources of Energy, held in Nairobi, at which the nations of the world gathered together and reassured each other how terribly important these things were, and how they could see the future, even days before climate change, needed to focus on these things. And to answer your question about how long does this take, it takes the same amount of time that any real decision takes. And the example that's very good is how long does it take to actually give someone a new passport? About that long. Time it takes to stamp a bit of paper. How long is this? But it takes months in many cases to actually get it. How long is this going to take? 1981 to 2015. I think we've gone backwards.
Would you like me to comment?
Up to you.
We should give the speaker a chance to respond here. Yes, please.
Absolutely. In fact, to be a devil's advocate, I would argue that this difference in the colors, at least some of it, and maybe a lot of it, is lip service. Right? I can tell you that in Canada there is no real plan to do anything. Right? Even though there have been plans, official plans, they're completely lip service. This is clearly the reality of it. At least some of it is lip service. But at the same time, can we really ignore that kind of change over 5 years? Right? I mean, first of all, not all of it is lip service, which I think is quite important to acknowledge. Right? And even if it is only discursive, right, that is a remarkable change over a very, very short period of time. That practically nobody would have believed if the prediction was made in the year 2000, right, that we will see that kind of sea change. And now look around, like follow the discourse industry last week, major meeting in Paris with all businesses, he's talking about it. Some of them have already shifted gears. And I think that it is important to acknowledge that as a positive sign. When it comes to the pace, I have a feeling that somebody will raise more questions and I'll respond my comment.
Then I'll take
So I'm a member of the Energy Institute today. That's how I got on this talk. My question's around, you talked about $500 billion climate fund, and I've read that Japan is asking for its new clean coal investments to be considered, or clean coal power stations to be considered as eligible for those climate fund payments. I want to get your perspective whether that is again us kind of moving backwards, because now there's a fund in place, and you just thought it was designed for low carbon, cleaner technologies, but now you've got a country saying, can I use it for a new Cold War?
Japan is a good country to discuss because there is clearly a step backward. In 2009, I believe it was October, yes, I remember this was in Bangkok, so in October of 2009, the Hatoyama government, who at that time was in power, made a spectacular announcement that Japan is adopting a pledge for 25% emission reductions by 2020, which was striking, astonishing, really. And then, during the same meeting, one day we go to the plenary session and I go to my table, representing Bulgaria, and I see a sheet, and there's a sheet in every single delegation from Japan, and it says the government of Japan is happy to announce that it is making $11.5 billion available for, short-term finance. So Japan really moved very, very strong forward. But then the government changed, and now the current government completely scrapped the 25% pledge. And now they're saying, no, we'll actually do 3.8% cuts, which is complete difference, right? And so, yes, clearly this is a process that goes back and forth, in fits and starts. But I would say the kind of social transformation that we're talking about, what else do we expect? Of course it's going to be in fits and starts. Of course there will be a devolution of the process at some point. Of course sometimes they'll move too slow. And this is probably the right time to say, we are really expecting a social transformation of a magnitude that is unprecedented in human history. Because we want to change everything, how we use technology, how we do things, how we make things what we do, right? Everything. If you look at, as historians, if we look at the evolution of human history, there are several such transformations. How long did they take? Take, for example, slavery. The end of slavery was a quite significant, remarkable social shift, right? I think they say it took about 150 years. Right? There was formally a treaty in the 1830s to end slavery. The practice continued until at least the end of the 19th century. So imagine the frustration of people who were engaged just like us in seeking that transformation. And would they have concluded that it is a complete failure, that nothing is happening? Well, and slavery didn't change, it exists today. But we still saw the dramatic transformation of 150 years. Compared to slavery, now the green shift to low carbon development is much bigger. It's much bigger. It is a much bigger challenge. And I don't think that it is fair to the pace of history for us to expect that this will change in 10 years, in 20 years. 20 years is nothing in historical perspective. I think that we're going to see a very slow process, and probably we won't see real lasting progress for the next several decades. But my feeling is that the process is irreversible.
I'm going to take two more questions. I'll take you, and then I'll take Chris.
Chris Gordon-Smith, Friends of the Earth. There are various negotiations, discussions going on about trade, so transatlantic trade investment partnership, TTIP, and other. Is there any connection and relationship between those discussions and these European discussions?
Yes. Basically, trade is part of every negotiation. Any environmental negotiation, take is part of it. Trade is part of it, just like finance is part of it. So yes, there is a linkage, and yes, the linkage is has a very real impact on the negotiations. Personally, I have not really focused those kinds of discussions closely. As everybody who has been at the COP knows, it is very common to have 15 different working groups in parallel.
Yeah. I think the point was some of them do have implications for carbon, some of these discussions.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Chris Rantley from UCL Earth Sciences. Thank you for your talk, which I enjoyed very much. Your message is very similar to one given by the organisation Globe, that has said these overarching discussions have sort of set the zeitgeist that have allowed other things to happen beneath them at different levels, multiple layers of governance. So we've seen some change. It does seem a shame, though, doesn't it, that this enormously expensive and effortful exercise can't deliver something more directly. So my question is, having seen similar negotiations actually with the Antarctic Treaty System that I used to be involved in, my strong impression was that the negotiators live in a sort of bubble of perceived localized self-interest. So they root for whatever their government departments or so on say they should root for. Very raw nationalized self-interest and benefits. So it's very granular and the big picture is lost. So to what extent does the IPCC and the science community in the real world, and the fact that we're seeing sea level going at 4 millimeters a year now, whereas it was stationary 100 years ago, how much does the real world really penetrate into this fog of negotiation? And if it doesn't, whose fault is that? Is that the science community's fault, or is it the way the thing is set up? You know, in the end, the real world surely must penetrate these and set a sense of urgency.
Yes. Personally, I completely agree with everything that you say. When it comes to science, first let me say that there isn't anyone involved in these talks that need any more evidence or persuasion that we have a catastrophic problem. This is something in which actually governments are ahead of the game when it comes to the general public. Right? No one questions climate science. And in the IPCC meetings, the crucial ones that I have attended, not even Saudi Arabia seriously questioned it. Remember that George Bush did not openly deny climate science, right? When it comes to whether the world penetrates in the diplomatic arena, I think it does, but I think that we need to take a different angle at it. To simplify things greatly for the sake of clarity, I would argue that the diplomacy has already played its part. It has launched a ship forward, and now it is becoming almost redundant. Because I think what is happening is the key trigger was launching the idea that there are economic benefits to be reaped from this new future. Everybody, well, not everybody, but many actors are moving in that direction now. Governments will get busy experimenting domestically, and when they gain more confidence about what they're doing, they will be then more willing to enshrine their commitments on formal agreements. So this is my personal interpretation of what I'm saying. In the meantime, unfortunately, if we focus squarely and very narrowly on these political discussions, they're hopeless. Right? It's just ridiculous. Yeah. Because they're not so important right now.
Well, I'm going to try to sum up. It's a little bit difficult. Expect some kind of success in the move towards low carbon any decade now. That's the first thing to say. The second thing I'd like to say is I think you really emphasised at various stages in your talk just how difficult the transition out of carbon is going to be. I'd like to perhaps reflect just very briefly on quite how difficult it was to get into carbon. So the Industrial Revolution itself was a huge experience for all of the nations that have gone through it so far, including this one. And for the nations that are currently going through it, China, India, Brazil, and so on. And we are asking probably 2/3 of the world's population to reverse that process while they are still in it, which I think is quite a challenging request to make. For those of you who are under the age of 50, and if you remember, I do tend to divide the world's population into those with and those without functioning knee joints. I think you're going to find the next few decades really very interesting indeed on the basis of this. If one of the tests of any talk is whether it's thought-provoking, Radoslav, I think we've probably succeeded in provoking thought. So I'd like us to put our hands together for a very interesting presentation.